In today's video, we're going to talk about should you buy a jointer? Now, this is not about should you buy this jointer, should you buy a benchtop jointer, any of that. We will discuss those a little bit at the end. That is more for you to decide after you've heard about what I think is important about should you buy a jointer in general. I can't make that final decision for you, but this is everything I went through in my head over about a 2-year period of time that finally led to me deciding to buy a jointer. Question number 1 on our list. Do you own a planer? If you do not already own a planer, this is an immediate no, it is not the right time for you to buy a jointer. Pause this video, close this video. You're going to need a planer first. Without the planer, the jointer does not serve a particularly useful purpose to most people. If you don't own one of these, it's not the right time to buy a jointer, and I highly would suggest getting a planer. I think they're great. We can joint on a planer, and with the table saw, we cannot plane with a jointer. Now, why is that? When we go to grab a piece of lumber that is either really rough or somewhat rough, like this piece of maple right here, we've got really rough sides, and this is not nice and flat at all. We've got really 6 sides that we have to think about here, but there are 4 main ones for milling. Face 1, face 2, edge 1, edge 2, and then the other 2 are going to be both of your end grain size for cutting the length, but for this purpose, face 1, face 2, face 3, and face 4 are the question as to why you actually need a planer, and a jointer without a planer is kind of purposeless. What the jointer is going to allow us to do is take face 1 and edge 1 and make face 1 flat and edge 1 90 degrees to face 1. That is all it's going to do for us. It's not going to allow us to do anything to face 2 to make it parallel to face 1. Or to edge 2 to make it parallel to edge 1. You may be asking yourself, can't I just flip this over? No, a jointer is designed to remove high spots, not to make the 2 sides equal to each other. So I hope you can see why you need the planer if you're going to buy the jointer. You can really only do half of the work. I still own both of my straight line rip jig, which also serves as a taper jig, and then my planer sled, because my planer is 13 inches, my jointer only does 10. If I have something wider than 10, I can use the planer to joint it on there using shims, a series of shims and hot glue and all of that, and we can get that face flat. It is much more time consuming, however, and we will come to that as another consideration. Now, just because it is so important that you have the planer first, I'm actually going to show you what happens if we run it through on both sides. I've got the calipers out. Now, if this worked, just running it through on both sides, we'll do the edges too, then it should be even thickness all the way around, and there should be an even width all the way through. Now, there won't be, but I'm going to show you that in measurements so you can really understand why you have to have the planer first. Now this worked out so well, I don't even really need the calipers. Fortunately, Home Depot pine, especially with a gigantic knot in it, is not flat at all. So what happened when we just jointed both sides? It's a giant wedge. This side is significantly thinner than the other side. It's even more obvious there. This back corner here is even thinner than the thin corner up here. That is why you cannot just flip the board around. Well, what about the width, you might ask? On this side, we've got about 6 and a little under 13/16. And on this side, we've got close, but not quite, 6 3/4 and a half. So we're about a 32nd of an inch off, give or take, on that side. So not as bad going this way because there wasn't a gigantic bow in it. Terrible on the faces. This, you would lose so much thickness to somehow now go to the planer and try to get this back. But you can get it flat, of course. It will just remove all of this side down to meet this side over here. Just running it through the planer makes this face and this face parallel, which is why we have to have them. And then the table saw will take one of these edges and make it totally parallel across to the other edge. Up next on our list, what type of woodworking are you trying to do? Are you trying to do detailed and precise joinery and fitting of things, or are you trying to build things that are going to use 2x4s, maybe some Home Depot pine, and a bunch of screws? A lot of what happens with milling things is we get something flatter, straighter, and square in a better way, obviously faster with a jointer, but even without a jointer, we can still get there with the planer sled and the table saw. And what this allows for is much more precise joinery. When something is flat going across other machines, the angle it's cutting at or whatever is cutting or being done to that is going to be more correct than if that board has a cup, a tip, or a wobble when you go to glue something together. If you've ever made a mitered box and you've just bought wood from somebody else as is, and it's not particularly flat, you've probably seen some gaps in your miters before, and that's often because that wood is not actually flat on there. The jointer, along with the planer, will allow us to get both sides nice and flat. If, however, you have no interest in any kind of fine joinery, or if you are totally satisfied with your experience currently of buying S4S lumber surface on 4 sides from someone, then perhaps you don't actually need the jointer. Personally, for me, one of the biggest reasons for getting this was I was not satisfied, certainly not satisfied with Home Depot lumber. But I have a lumber yard around here and I order online, and they would sell stuff as S4S. This was before, I even kind of thought about a jointer, and it was just never actually flat. I always had to do the planer sled anyways on my own, which meant I lost thickness. I ended up eventually just moving more into rough lumber. Do you have any interest in rough lumber, which can be very cupped, very bowed, very twisted, something like that? And again, we can use other methods, but it is significantly more kind of efficient, and I think even in some cases more accurate when we use the jointer. So if you are looking to do a lot of fine detailed work and you are not happy with the current state of the lumber that you get it in, if it is S4S and you are being told that it is ready to use, then yes, if you have the planer, it is a good idea to definitely consider getting the jointer now. We touched on earlier with our efficiency and with our speed of how long it can take. If you've only got 1 or 2 boards, doing a planer sled with some hot glue and some shims, while a bit annoying and a bit time consuming, is not bad. But if you've got to do 5, 10 different pieces, this will take a lot longer to actually get even just one of these sides nice and flat, and then one of them nice and squared on the edge. With the jointer, there is no hot glue, there is no double-sided tape, there's no shimming, there is no lugging around your planer sled and feeding it in and out. You simply run the board over the jointer on the face, then on the edge. That was actually one of the kind of tipping point final ones. Once I'd answered yes to a lot of the other ones, it came down to I was doing a project, I had quite a few boards I needed to do, and it took me almost 2 hours to get all of them done, maybe even longer. And I prefer to mill in 2 sessions, so imagine having to do that twice to get all of them on the planer sled, through the planer, through the jointing jig, through the planer again on the other side to get that parallel, and then through the table saw to rip. It just was extremely time consuming. So if you answer yes to all of this other stuff and you find yourself extremely frustrated with how long it's taking to mill a large number of pieces of wood for a bigger project, this is something you should definitely consider to cut down on that time. I wanted to compare the speed of these two a little bit. So I've taken a 1x12 and I've ripped it directly down the middle with a bandsaw, so we have 2 basically identical pieces of wood. Since this has been ripped, neither of them are terribly cupped, but there is a little bit of a twist in each. I'm going to do the jointer and the planer, and then the planer sled and the table saw rip. And I will speed this up a gazillion X, but I will include the time that it took in real time to actually do this. Well, as you can see, one of them is significantly faster. Now, there were a few things that added some time onto the planer sled that were my mistake. There were about 15 seconds of having to move the hose back because I forgot to flatten the other face before I cut the straight line or the straight edge on the board, but we're talking minimal seconds there. I'm not counting camera movements. I had to do it for both of them. Maybe another 20 seconds there for both of them, but that cancels out. Now, there are some other variables with the planer sled. The first is that you either have to have a bunch of shims cut, or you may have to cut more while you're doing it if you're doing a bunch of boards. However, if you're doing a bunch of boards and the hot glue gun is already heated up, that time isn't applied to the second, third, fourth, and so on board. You may also have a battery-powered hot glue gun that heats up instantly. I do not. That will remove some time there. I think one variable, though, is if you've got your jointer set up correctly and you know your technique, it's going to come out correct. It's very easy to not quite correctly get the planer sled shimmed. If you have one spot missing, you won't know until you're all the way done with that side. And then if it's not correct, you would have to reshim it and redo it again. So if you get those correct, that's great. But if you make a mistake, it can be totally a start over kind of process. In the end, results the same, faster, jointer, it's that simple. Now, because for most of us, money is certainly limited, it is finite, we did not win the lottery recently, we have another question. What other tools do you already have, and are there any other tools that are going to cost a fair bit of money similar to a jointer that would open up other types of woodworking for you that you would either find more important or you would use far more often? There are a collection of tools I like to call the Big Six, maybe you could call it the Big Seven, involving things like the drill press, bandsaw, the router table, planer, miter saw, things like that. What of these do you have? I assume you have a table saw already, but if you don't, that is going to be number one on the list. Do you think adding something like a bandsaw is going to open up more types of woodworking for you, or you're going to use it far more, and therefore the investment you would be putting in money-wise and space-wise would be better used on something like a bandsaw? In a weird way, the jointer actually doesn't get used a whole lot. Gets used at the beginning of every project, maybe some other time during if you're getting a different piece of wood you're adding in later and you're going to joint it and plane it and mill it later into the project. But it sits in kind of the away storage area most of the time for me. I use it pretty swiftly at the beginning of the project and then it sits there. I am on my bandsaw far more. I am on my drill press and router table far more. In terms of time spent and actual usage, those things get far more of it, let alone the table saw, which is by far the most used thing in my shop. Maybe the bandsaw, but probably the table saw. So if you have something that you've been looking to cut into curves or some kind of anything like that, boxes, you want to put edge profiles, different grooves, dados, stuff like that, box joints, that kind of joinery, a bandsaw or a router and a router table may simply be a better use of money and space than the jointer will be, because at the end of it all, this is just a relatively little used tool in that it does its function and it does it pretty fast and pretty well, and then it gets put away until the next project. So if you've been eyeing up a few different variety of tools, think about which of those is going to be most impactful to allowing you to do more unique, different types of woodworking. At the end of the day, those were the main questions I had to ask myself. And once I'd answered yes to all of those, and especially got to those last few points of being frustrated with time and efficiency, it was, for me, time to buy the jointer. So we'll get into a last little bit here. Which jointer should you buy? Not necessarily brand, though I do love this one, but maybe it's not for everyone, but benchtop versus full size. Much like whether you should buy one or not, I cannot totally answer that for you, but I'm going to walk through a few considerations here, again, ones that I had to deal with in terms of why I ended up with a benchtop jointer. Number one, first and foremost, is going to be cost. Large jointers cost more than their equivalent widths in benchtop versions. It's just that simple. If you want a 10-inch full-size standing jointer, not only are you going to need possibly thousands of dollars for something new, if you can find one used, great, but then you are going to also need a lot more space and a lot more power. Space and power become a big thing when we're talking about benchtop jointers. Now, there are obviously limitations. Because of the size of this, we have a shorter bed, but it does not take up anywhere near the length or just total footprint of a 10-inch wide jointer that is fully standing. If you also want a fully standing wide jointer, you are going to need 220 volts. Anything over 6 inches, for the most part, is going to require 220 volts to run the larger motor. There are 6 inches that are 110, and you can get away with those, but if width is important to you and you're willing to sacrifice full size and some motor power to get width, which was one important thing to me, the benchtop is going to be more up your alley, though you will notice that the motor is nowhere near as powerful as something that is larger, but will take 220. I don't have 220 in here. That would have been a whole nother expense to add on top, which I couldn't afford to do both. If you are like me and width is arguably the biggest issue, but you're not interested in super long boards, a benchtop certainly becomes interesting. I do think there are limitations on the kind of efficiency or outcome when it comes to length with these. I do not think the outcomes when we start getting over 40, 48 inches are particularly great. There are diminishing returns. You are not going to get a clean, nice, flat, straight board with a 6-foot board on a benchtop, the reference surface of the tables is simply not long enough. So if you are looking to joint a bunch of 6 or 8-foot boards, it is just not going to work out as well for you to go with the benchtop. You are probably going to have to go with a full-size standing jointer, which is going to be very large. And if you want it to do wide long boards, it's going to have to be really big. If you were like me though, and 40-ish inches is kind of your top out point for most things, the benchtop certainly becomes viable and you can get excellent results with these. Now this isn't a deal breaker, but the larger and larger they get, and especially the wider it gets, the more chips that are going to evacuate at once. Having something like a bigger dust collector is going to help. It doesn't have to be huge. This is only a 1.75 horsepower, again limited, especially because of not only cost, but by 110, 120 volt. But these do put out quite a bit. However, if you are able to do dust collection well with your planer, you're almost certainly going to be okay here. But at the end of the day, space, money, and power are going to be your biggest considerations on top of what are you actually trying to joint. If it is long, big, wide boards, the benchtop is just not going to be for you. If it is shorter, wide boards, benchtop is fine. If it is longer, thin boards, either one up to a certain length, though a 6-inch jointer standing is going to be much better for 5, 6 foot, 6-inch, 4-inch boards than a shorter one is. So that is a different question, but hopefully that gives you a bit of an insight as to whether you want to go benchtop or standing. Now, as to which one amongst the brands, that is a different question that I can't answer for you at all because I don't have enough money or space or power to try a large variety of jointer brands. All right, hopefully that helps you today. If you have any other things that you considered before you bought yours, or things that are perhaps limiting you from buying one of yours now because you haven't answered yes to a question, please put them in the comments below. I hope that helped. Thanks for joining me today. Bye.